Orla. It's very difficult to know where to start with such a widespread budget, but it can be summed up as saying it was a transfer again of wealth to the rich, to the highest paid in society, and little or nothing given to those most savagely hit by austerity in the last 6 years. And there's many, many examples of that. In the government's own booklet, they have an example of John, who's a minimum wage worker and is set to receive 173 euros a year because of the changes to the universal social charge. But unfortunately, John will have that completely wiped out by a 178 water charge. So John will actually be €5 less well off after this budget. It's been well publicised this afternoon by Social Justice Ireland. The gap between the rich and the poor has actually increased following your budget by €500 a year. You've given to those at the top. Anyone over 70,000 will gain about €736 a year, while the low-paid, women and parents, three groups that were savagely hit since the crisis began in 2008, have been given little or nothing. And I'll give you a few examples of that. I'll also draw your attention to the fact that the biggest social crisis we have in our society, the housing crisis, will be aided in little or no way by the budget. And another group that seems to have been completely neglected is the rented sector, which makes up 30.3% of all people who live in Ireland right now, who got nothing from this budget as well. I'll start with low-paid workers. The government seems to think that a low-pay commission, which was announced when Joan Burton took over, and you repeated again yesterday, is necessary. Who needs a low-pay commission? Workers need a pay increase. That's what they need. And the idea that setting up a commission is going to somehow assuage the majority in our society, 65% of people in Ireland earn less than €32,000 a year. So far from being a squeezed middle, it's actually a hard-pressed majority that's out there now, thanks to the taxes and the pay cuts of the last 6 years. So we don't need a low-pay commission. Another group that have taken a hammering under austerity, as pointed out by the National Women's Council, is women. Women tend to be in part-time jobs in the low-paid sector and half as likely as men to earn €50,000. And yet, what you handed back to women yesterday in terms of child benefit was €5 a month. I think it was pointed out by the National Women's Council, you took 400 million in child benefit was taken from people in the last 6 years, and 70 million was given back yesterday. So, yeah, So the group most savagely hit by austerities, the groups, the low-paid and women, who tend to actually be in that same category, gained little or nothing. The people hit disproportionately by it. Single parents, again, savagely hit in so many ways and in no way compensated by the budget of yesterday. To give you an example of the rent allowance issue, which you didn't reverse any of the cuts that you've made in rent allowance in the last 3 to 4 years. To give an example of a family who are renting, who might be waiting on the housing waiting list. Dublin rents, and I'll use Dublin as an example where rents have gone up the furthest, in the second quarter this year had risen by nearly 20% compared to the same quarter in 2010. On top of this, rent supplement limits have been cut by 12%. So you have a situation, and I'll give you an example of a family who are going to suffer even more since the budget than not. A family with 2 children renting a home who would have been paying a rent of €1,110 a month in 2010 would have got, this is at the maximum amount, €1,086 a month in rent supplement in that year. Today, that same couple will be paying €1,300 a month in rent, and they'll get €935 in rent supplement. So they're actually €365 a month worse off, or €85 a week. You know, nothing has been done for people like that, the 100,000 families who are waiting on housing, who can't afford to buy, and have now been abandoned by the government. You did nothing to reverse those cuts. On the housing crisis, far from being, I think one of the ministers, not sure if it was yourself or another, on the radio this morning said that this was the most significant social housing programme ever. It's not. In 1975, there was 8,500 council houses built that year. Next year, you're proposing to build 2,500. This is in the midst of the biggest housing crisis in the history of the state. The fact of the matter is, in the 1970s, there was a response to the housing crisis of the 1960s. A house building programme through local authorities was undertaken. But now there seems to be an ideological aversion in this government and in the last one to such a house building programme. What your programme will deliver, if it comes through, is 10,000 houses by 2018, so that's over 4 years, which is 10% of the current waiting lists. But why so slow? Why such a softly approach? During the Celtic Tiger, 80 to 100,000 houses were built every year. So the idea that we have to wait 4 or 5 or 10 years to solve the housing crisis is not the case. You could go back to funding councils and letting them build houses. Instead, what was done was more money was thrown at landlords, more money was thrown at developers, and more money was thrown at land speculators through a cut in the windfall tax. Instead of actually helping the people who are in danger of becoming homeless every day and who won't have a prospect of a home for many, many years if things carry on the way they are. Just another group that was badly hit by your budget is, again, all sections of workers actually. Those on minimum wage, as I pointed out, gain 174, whereas the top 10% gain 736. I mean, what sort of a response is that to the 6 years of austerity? Instead, what could have been done, Minister, is you could have made tax changes, absolutely. You could have, for example, imposed an emergency 5% tax on millionaires on any income over 1 million, and that would have brought in 3.3 billion. But instead, you decided to give them even more money. You could have given an increase in the effective income tax rate on the top 10% instead of giving less, which would have brought in 2.6 billion. And you could have broken your sacred cow of corporation tax of 12.5% and increased to the EU average 27. If you chose to do that, we could have brought in over 5 billion from multinational corporations. Again, a financial transactions tax could bring in, depending on the level, anything from 400 to 600 million euros. But most of all, the elephant in the room this year, every €5 collected in taxation, €1 will still go to the bondholders. We are being crippled by a debt which should have been repudiated. 8 billion in interest will be paid this year. 8 billion could solve the housing crisis. It could build 45,000 homes. It could put 45,000 people back to work with real jobs, not Job Plus, not Job Bridge, but actual real jobs, which people need to stimulate the economy and to provide social housing, affordable housing. And the other group, of course, that you've left out is the working poor. You decided through the central bank system to make it 20% requirement for deposits in order to buy a house, which basically means only rich kids will ever be able to get a mortgage now because they've mummies and daddies to help them out, whereas other people who are stuck in the rented sector, which are rocketing, won't be able to save anything. So far from thinking that you've solved your election prospects for next year, with the water charges, which has overshadowed everything that you've brought in, any concessions on universal social charge. And by the way, universal social charge was a tax introduced to pay for the bailout. So if we're in recovery, why wasn't it abolished? Why should any worker on €12,000 have to pay a universal social charge in the first place? You've continued and maintained a tax that was brought in to pay for the bondholders' debt, which is an absolute shame on your government. It certainly won't get you out of the crisis that you're facing into. You should have seen from the by-elections at the weekend, from the 100,000 who took to the streets. They won't be assuaged by what you did yesterday.